Whether adopted as an infant or as a much older youth, whether placed through the child welfare system or privately, adopted people often share common feelings and experiences. In this video, we will identify some of the most common feelings associated with being adopted. We'll hear from adoption experts, adult adoptees, and adoptive parents to learn how parents can support their children and help them manage their feelings at various developmental stages.
Feelings about being adopted are as individual as each child is. Every child is born with a certain personality and a certain temperament. Layer on some of the stressors that can come, that can affect how your brain is wired, and kids are going to respond very differently to different circumstances.
No two children, no two families, and no two adoption stories are exactly the same. Even so, it can be helpful to anticipate some of the most common feelings that shape many adoption experiences. Most adopted children feel different. Many hear the message that they're lucky to have been adopted, that they should feel grateful. Even children placed as babies may feel responsible for their own relinquishment. Many internalize a sense of shame, the feeling that they are somehow unworthy. All adopted children think about their birth families at some point in their development. These thoughts and feelings can lead to conflicted emotions, loyalty issues, and guilt. Central to all of these feelings and experiences is one universal reality that no member of the adoption constellation can escape: loss. Adoptive parents who anticipate these feelings are better prepared to recognize and validate them when they arise. In the following segments, we explore ways for adoptive families to help their children make sense of these feelings as they emerge and re-emerge during the growing up years and beyond. For many children, being adopted can create a sense of being different.
Just that feeling of being different. I'm different from my family. I don't fit in. I don't look like them. I don't act like them, or I don't like the same things.
Trying to figure out, who am I like, where did I come from, and where am I going?
Most children do not like to feel different from their peers. In the school age years, children who are part of adoptive families begin to realize that most of their peers are being raised by the same people that gave birth to them. And that does make them feel different.
In adolescents, they don't want to be different. You know, if you go to a mall on a Saturday and stand behind a group of adolescents, they all look alike. And being adopted makes me feel different.
Being adopted transracially or transculturally can add another layer of complexity to the feeling of differentness.
I was adopted from South Korea in 1971, and I was adopted to a family in Minnesota. In many ways, it was a very idyllic childhood. I'd say the one thing that wasn't so idyllic was that my family did not know how to talk about race, and they did not know how to talk about identity, and I grew up in a predominantly white community. And so as a Korean transracially adopted child, that was really difficult for me. My family used to say to me all the time, I don't see you as Korean, I just see you as part of our family. But the thing is, I am Korean, and I am a part of their family. I can be both at the same time. So when you tell an adopted child, you're just like everybody else in the family, it's a lovely sentiment, because you're telling them we include you, but it's also telling them that we want to include you, and even though you're different. And then that even though part is the part that is a sticking point that can be troublesome for a kid. If you say, you're different, and we love that you're different and that you're part of this family, because our family embraces all kinds of diversity, that's a very different thing.
I think as a parent, it's really important to celebrate and to recognize the differences in our kids. Being able to celebrate racial differences, skin tone differences, different gender identities, sexual orientations, is about promoting, supporting, and developing their identity in a very positive way.
To help them understand that their difference is part of what makes them unique and valuable and why they're a special part of the family. You can do the same thing by, looking at a garden and telling your child, look at all these different pretty flowers, and they're all different, but they look so nice together when they're in a garden. And, as a family, we might be all different flowers, but we are all part of the same garden. I really encourage intercountry adoptive parents and transracial adoptive parents to consider their child's cultural and racial needs as being as important as any other of their child's needs, including medical needs and educational needs and spiritual needs and social needs.
Adopted children often hear the message that they're lucky to have been adopted, a perspective that may conflict with the reality of their losses and could undermine their sense of self-worth.
I think when kids hear that they're so lucky, or, oh, you should be grateful that you're with your adoptive family, I think the job first starts with adoptive parents.
And so parents really need to help kids understand that they're not responsible for that burden of feeling lucky or grateful. At the root of this comment is that there's something so inherently wrong and problematic about the child's situation, who they are, their family of origin, that they have to not be there anymore, and that they were rescued and saved. And I think that it's really easy for children then to internalize that sense of, I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, there was something really wrong with me, that I had to be adopted, and that I should be, because it's so bad, that I should be so grateful now to have been adopted.
There's a couple of things. Helping prep with friends and family and people that are routinely in their life, and helping them understand that, this is not the context we want to put things in, and helping them be mindful of it. I think, but to also help kids themselves.
To help the child understand where these messages are coming from and why. And that part of it is just around the misunderstanding that society has around adoption.
Some families may choose to practice role-playing. If this comes up, what do you want to say back?
If you're unlucky enough that it happens, before you have that conversation, you can use that as a jumping point to then say, how should we handle this if it happens again the next time? And I think by doing it together, then that child can do it on their own, because most of the time this happens even when the parents aren't around.
I also think it's equally important that sometimes when you think your kids aren't listening, many of our kids are hypervigilant and are listening all the time. So to really take every opportunity to educate other people, to help course correct and help model what we want our kids to hear.
Coming to terms with what it means to be adopted is a lifelong process. And part of that process is clarifying the reasons for the adoption. Many adopted children struggle with the sense that they were somehow responsible for the circumstances that led to their placement.
We know that many kids will feel responsible for their relinquishment, whether that means they were removed or they were voluntarily placed. But we know that it's not uncommon for kids to feel that that's somehow their fault. A child adopted as an infant may wonder, wasn't I cute enough? Wasn't I a good enough baby? Why was I given away? Kids who have been adopted out of foster care may think that they somehow could have changed the outcome, that if only they had done something different, they could have stayed with their birth parents. And even kids adopted internationally struggle with, why wasn't I good enough? Why was I sent away?
I think we have to reinforce over and over again in very clear ways that this is really about adult decisions. There's nothing that a child did or would do that could cause them being taken away or a planned decision around a placement. And sometimes I have to say to kids, I want you to look me straight in the eyes, and I want you to hear what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is the truth, and I want you to know that there's nothing that you did.
Shame is one of the most common feelings associated with being adopted. No matter what type of adoption, private domestic, child welfare, or intercountry, adopted children often believe there is something intrinsically wrong with them and that they deserved to lose their birth families.
I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, there was something really wrong with me, that I had to be adopted.
One of my children at the age of 5 told me she didn't believe she deserved to be on this planet. She didn't have the same right to be on the planet as other people.
For children adopted from foster care, the shame is often compounded by the circumstances that led to the placement.
There could have been sexual abuse, physical abuse, there could have been drug addiction, histories of incarceration, and how do they integrate those familial histories into their own sense of self?
It is always important, though, to be able to help children understand that even though their birth parents were doing things that were difficult and interfering with parenting, that they're not bad people, that they are good people who made bad decisions.
In many cases, the decision to relinquish a baby is a loving and courageous one, made in the child's best interest. Understanding how and why the decision was made can mitigate a child's sense of shame.
You're a little baby. Yep.
If the adoptive parents have contact with birth parents in what's called an open adoption, which is either in domestic, private, or in foster care adoptions, if there's contact, the birth parents are also a source of answers for the children.
What we want to do, just like we want our kids to develop empathy for anyone, is understand that all of us are a mix of strengths and challenges. So we try to help them find those strengths.
If I can find good in the birth family, that means I find good in you, because that's where you came from. Particularly if they're carrying this shame and this feeling that there was something wrong with them in the first place, or they would still be with their family of origin. But if they know that their artistic ability came from their grandmother, perhaps, or their musical ability, or their athletic ability, or their gorgeous smile, or their infectious laugh came from their birth family, that gives them something positive to anchor to.
All adopted children think about their birth parents at some point in their lives, whether they remember them, or still have contact with them, or don't even know who they are.
Whether I was placed 3 minutes old into my adoptive family's arms, or I joined my family at 7 or 15, that I'm still going to have these psychological connections to my birth family.
They have bond with that family. So that is in itself a bit of a struggle for them. But they also feel very loving and positive toward their adoptive families.
These feelings can lead to loyalty issues.
Where, they're pining and thinking about those relationships and those connections, and at the same time feel safe and loved by the families that they're with, and feel conflicted about where their loyalties should lie.
We tell our kids, we can love more than one child. Why couldn't you love more than one parent? How does that in any way diminish your relationship with me? It doesn't. It doesn't. So when you give them permission to miss their birth parents or their birth family, or to wonder about them, or to want contact with them, it actually brings you much, much, much closer in your parent-child relationship.
I've always known I was adopted, so that was an easy piece, but I never had a divided loyalty because I had always been given permission from the beginning to be able to explore finding birth family whenever I wanted to.
I think that I did have some feelings of split loyalty, and I was 30 when I started my birth family search, and I still felt like I was wanting to protect my adoptive parents' feelings when I went through to do the search myself. So yeah, I think that it's really tough if you don't have these conversations. My parents never said, we totally support you finding your birth family, and I think had I known that, I wouldn't have felt any sense of split loyalty. But because they never verbalized it, I was too scared to ask. And so I just did it on my own.
Loss is a central theme in adoption, and it affects everyone touched by adoption. Only when losses are acknowledged, validated, and grieved can children and families move forward.
Everyone who's parenting kids who aren't growing up with the woman to whom they were born need to understand that there's loss, and that loss is just an inherent part of adoption, and that loss is real for our kids even if they were adopted at birth. there is still a very primal loss there.
I think the loss is unique in the sense that it's ambiguous, and what I mean by that is for most of the time when we think about a loss, we think about finality of a loss. You know, there's a death, there's finality, you mourn and grieve that loss.
The difference between a death and an adoption is that with adoption, it's only seen as a celebration. And so it makes it really difficult then if the person is feeling some sadness about that adoption as well.
When we're not honest with our kids about adoption, or when there's no connection, they still know there's a parent, there's a family out there.
They still feel so real to you, but they're not there.
And so when you think about loss in that way, it's really hard for children to manage the ambiguity. It's very hard to mourn a loss that isn't final.
But it's really important that adoptive parents understand the loss and grief that their children experience, not be threatened by it, and be prepared to support their children.
And depending upon where the child is developmentally, find those developmentally appropriate strategies to help the child articulate the feelings. And from there, we need to mourn the losses.
I now, over the past several years, will watch my daughter sometimes be sad. And be in her room and be teary and say, I miss my birth mother. We call her Mama Linda. She has a name. We give her permission to talk about those things. And it allows her to be able to explore those feelings, to express that sadness.
Sometimes we think that children won't experience loss or grief, but we know that's not the case, and we also know that they process it differently at different developmental ages.
This does not mean that children do not love their parents or not attached to their parents. It has nothing to do with the parents. It doesn't mean that the children would rather live with their birth parents.
I often say in social work, we become really good at understanding that things can be both and, not either or. So in adoption, it doesn't have to be either just joy and gain or loss and devastation. They can happen at the same time. There's both loss and there's joy at the same time. That when a child has lost their birth parents or their families of origin, that we shouldn't expect them to move on, but we move forward with them. And the adoptive parents are really a key part of helping a child move forward with that loss.